Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Writing and Narrative Design panel for the SGDA Summit of 2021. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, depending on where you guys are in the world. I am based in California, so it is currently morning for me. Today we have, today is the second day of the SGDA Summit, so we have all sorts of events coming up, including a couple of panels, student showcases, and some talks. So hope you guys can join us. But for now, I am joined by Ann Toole, Jay Turner, and Tori Schaefer for the Writing and Narrative Design panel. Folks, would you be able to introduce yourselves in the order that I just said? Starting with Ann.
Hi, I'm Ann Toole. I am a writer of various things. I worked on the first Witcher. More recently, I worked on Days Gone. I did some early writing for that. I did some writing for Horizon Zero Dawn, including the comics. And I work in different media as well, animation, short fiction, and more. So that's me, and I'm based in West Hollywood.
Okay, Jay, you're next.
I am Jay Turner. I'm currently a narrative designer at Obsidian, and I started my career at BioWare, where I worked on Dragon Age Origins, Mass Effect 2, Jade Empire, and others. And then I went on to several other studios like Visceral and Cryptic, and now I'm at Obsidian. I'm also in California, but I'm in San Jose.
Hi, I'm Tori. I am a senior narrative designer at Spellbreak, which is a action battle PvP game. I used to work for Elder Scrolls Online, which is an MMO. Really excited to be here.
Great, awesome. Okay, so for any audience members, the way this is going to work is we're going to have a section of questions that I have pre-written towards our lovely panelists. After that, we're going to have an audience Q&A session. So if you have any questions for narrative designers and writers, be sure to share those in the Twitch chat or on Discord, which there should be a link for that in the Twitch chat as well. So to start off, I want to get a question about you folks. So when it comes to writing and narrative design, there's a bit of a distinction between like writing, like so just pure words, and gameplay. Where do you folks lie on that spectrum in your own sort of like, how would you describe what you do in that regard?
Well, I'll jump in first. I
Great.
definitely think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy. There's a feeling I get a lot because I primarily identify as a writer. It's a strange way to put it. But there's this feeling that writing is just like the dialogue or the text you see on screen. But writing is creating the story, creating the experience that the player goes through, and that is design. And so it's kind of both at the same time. You can't really take one out of the other unless you're doing Tetris, maybe. But even Tetris, you can, they have that different settings Tetris, which is world building. So I think that's what I say a lot. I put down writer and narrative designer, and it really depends on the team you're working on. I've worked on projects where they just write. We'll stay away from the design. And so I've definitely gotten that critique, but others are much more open. And I will often write a narrative design document, which from my perspective is telling the story through means other than character and dialogue, which would include environment, art, gameplay, collectibles, any tool you have at your disposal to tell the story. Because in my view, the best way to tell a story is without, you can tell a story without any words. And that's kind of the goal.
Yeah, I'll join in. I think it depends on the project, as she said. There are projects where the gameplay is going to be first, and in that case, then my role is to make a story that works well within that gameplay and doesn't distract from the gameplay. And then there's other projects where the story is first, and I get to kind of go wild and have fun with it, and then kind of go to the gameplay and say, no, you're not serving the story. And then there's things in the middle, kind of like the Mass Effect series, where everything kind of meshes together as much as possible, and they try to serve many masters. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But in any of those cases, it's our job to advocate for the story as much as we can within the project, and then know when to kind of merge into the gameplay as needed too. Like we need to know when to kind of stop fighting for the story and let gameplay take the spotlight.
Yeah, I'll say you're never going to really find a studio that says what narrative design is the same way between both studios. So you might just be mostly writing, doing content, doing level design, doing some engineering work with like, Python or C++ or stuff like that. It's just there's a lot of range. So I mean that makes it exciting. It also makes it a little bit like, do I have the right skill set? I don't know. Like maybe for some studios, maybe not for others. But yeah.
Yeah, I've
Right.
found that no two companies have the same job descriptions for any position. And I also found the smaller the project and smaller the team, the more hats you have to wear, no matter what you're doing on the project. So you can't really stick with one descriptor or one job description and sail through.
Right, got it. Okay. So I want to hear a little bit more about how like your work looks like. So what types of projects are you working on? Well, don't break any NDA, of course, but what are you folks like up to? What are you working on? And what does like the writing process look like for you in your current position? Like creating a character, creating a scene. What's like the pipeline look like?
Well, it kind of follows up with what Jay was saying. It very much depends on the project. So some projects I'm brought in very early, and so it's coming up with pitches and, like I said earlier, writing a narrative design documents that incorporates all the tools at your disposal to tell the story. And sometimes I'm brought in much later in the process where they may have had a story in mind, they've had lots of cuts, and now they need to make sense of it, or they are already in production and they just need dialogue written at that point. And it very much varies based on the individual company's pipeline and where they are in the process, since I'm primarily freelance. And I would say probably Jay and Tori have other experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on all sorts of teams and all sorts of projects, and for the most part, it's been RPG work, and that is usually a team of people. And in that case, I'm usually working pretty closely with an area or level designer or like a content designer type, and we kind of come up with what a specific area is going to be like, and then I take over for making sure the story flows through that area. I have been the only writer on a project before, and that meant I had to do all of that. But right now, especially at Obsidian, I'm part of a team of people who all care about the narrative, and we're all working together to make sure that the narrative serves the game, and the game serves the narrative.
Yeah, I'll say for my first experience with ESO, I was mainly writing. So I'd work with the content designers to create the story of that quest, right? Giving input, giving suggestions, things like that. And then they would kind of create the quest, and I would go in and I would basically edit and rewrite a lot of it to make sure that it was within the standard, within the tone of ESO. And I knew a lot of lore and a lot of characters. Don't even get me started on like wood elves or high elves or dark elves. I know a lot more than I probably need to for a lifetime. But and then when I went to Spellbreak, I became a narrative designer slash writer slash content designer. Many hats. It's a much smaller team. So now I do like I come up with the story beats, and then I come up with like documentation of like everything. Oh, I need this from art. I need this from environment. I need these animations, and I come up with all those lists and stuff, and I work with all those teams. And I'll actually go into Unreal and I'll like be like, oh, when you have to go to this item and pick it up, and I'll actually set that up within tech. So this is a much more tech heavy role because it's more content design as well. So like I'll actually create the objects that the player interacts with, and like and we do have level designers who set them up within world, but that's kind of like where I hand that off as well. So a lot more hats as I get. Usually it's smaller company, more hats tends to be, and it's really interesting and fun both ways. Don't get me wrong. I'm learning a lot. Spellbreak, I got to do more specific writing work within Elder Scrolls, so just really a big spectrum.
Awesome. So I actually want to hear a little bit more about this stuff. So the games that you guys are working on are pretty wildly different. So Tori, you mentioned you're working on Spellbreak, which is like a PvP battle royale. I saw that. I was like, how does story fit in there? It was really interesting to look into. How does gameplay, like the types of games you're working on, affect what types of writing that you're doing and how you're implementing that. Sorry, specifically, it sounds like you're doing some implementation as well. How does gameplay fit in with all this for you folks?
Right. So I think like a great example is when I was working on ESO. Actually, I know you just asked me about spell break, but for
No,
ESO,
I want to hear about both of these, so you're
I would
good.
I would work in overworld quests and then I'd work on dungeons. And when you work in overworld quests, you can have a lot more dialogue, a lot more exposition. You can like actually explain, go do this because of this reason. You can develop story and character. And then within a dungeon, a lot of people are going to ignore it. I know it's sad, but a lot of people are just going to run past it and beat up the next boss. So you have to have a much more linear story, simple beats, like barks, very short dialogues, optional dialogues, right? You usually have like a starting dialogue where they pick up the quest and the ending dialogue where they finish the quest. And you kind of have to make it so that you can understand the story no matter what you engage with, which is, hard. And yes, you can't make as complex of a story, but really interesting and fun as well, right? And you can make up some really kooky, wild characters because they have to really stand out in a very short amount of time. For spell break, we're always trying to make quests that are quick to do, easily directed, because you are playing within a battle royale zone basically, and then the arena is going to start shrinking. You're not just in this overworld. We don't really have NPC interactions within the world because you are playing a PvP game, so they're much more quicker things like, oh, go collect these notes that somebody hid, and they'll like direct you to an area that you can then quickly collect things, or oh, okay, go ahead and do this. And then we have weekly beats, so we try to keep it like segmented within weekly beats as well. So we'll have like an intro, you go do the quest, we have an outro, but we do have VO and dialogue and cast of characters. I actually work with some really amazing voice actors for all the characters I work on, which is always super fun. So I do like voiceover still, and we do like sessions and things like that. But yeah, just like you gotta kind of keep in mind, what is the player's main goal while playing this game? How can my story, as Jay said, not hinder it, but also maybe make it a little more exciting and fun? Like, if you know what the princess is like, it's much more fun to save her, or like why she's being kidnapped and things like that. Just like as a super simple example. But yeah.
Awesome.
One of the skills that I've found useful is determining what information is absolutely vital for the mission and what information is just optional stuff that you'd really love to write about, but the players may not care about. And it depends on the game. Like working on an MMO at Cryptic, I found that optional information was far more likely to get skipped in an MMO than in something like a Mass Effect. But at Obsidian, where we can kind of assume a certain player is playing and they're more likely to dig into lore and care about that stuff. So we're going to form our branching narratives a little bit differently. But you still want a straight through line for those people who don't want to deal with all that stuff. That's just like, oh, you need to get the thing. And maybe why you need to get the thing is an optional thing. So the player can go like, okay, I'm just bashing A until I get through. But they still know what's going on and still understand what they're doing exactly.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I guess it's a rite of passage for every writer to work on an MMO, because I also worked on an MMO. And definitely the rule of thumb was only 25% of your players are going to care about the story. This is probably, like Jay was saying, it probably varies based on what genre game it is and like who your audience is. But that ties in a little bit to the first question: is this writing or design? Having studied and learned about multiplayer games and Bartle's player types, which are actually more than 4, but for ease there are 4. You have to keep in mind what player types there are, and you're writing for them too. So you are also writing for the explorers who are completionists and want to go through every nook and cranny, but you're also writing for socializers. And one thing that I think is really interesting, especially in MMOs and multiplayer, is a lot of the time the story is communicated by other players. So the idea that you need to communicate it to these socializers, the socializer subtype that likes to teach, or pontificate or blather, said with love. You have to communicate the story to them, and then they're going to say it again. So it becomes this like oral history, which makes it very, very interesting. but it's kind of a challenge at the same time because I know I played MMOs that were just like walls of text, and I was like, I'm playing with somebody's talking to me, I'm never going to read this, but they've read it, so they can just tell me. So, it definitely becomes like these extra layers of how you can communicate the story, and often the way to tell the story is through other players.
I think it's a rite of passage for writers to be told only 25% of people will care about your story.
Hey, it's more than who cares about the fishing mini game, so we got
Hey,
that
that's
at
true.
least.
That's true.
Well, I for one love fishing
What are
mini
you talking about?
I love fishing mini game. No offense, I'm the 5% that loves the fishing mini game as well, for sure.
All right. Well, man, that was just a lot of great stuff. So yeah, it was funny. All you guys did work on MMOs. It's great. So I want to talk a little bit more about the fact that I've heard a few times, like, hey, if someone's playing through your quest in like an MMO, for example, they're not paying attention. They still need to know what the key details are. So what are some strategies to do that? How do you get a player to know, like, oh, these are the characters that I'm working with. Here's what I'm trying to do if they aren't reading?
Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
I was just going to say repetition. You can go, you can go on.
A really quick tip is to just make the last line what they have to do. Like, make sure, like, now go kill those rats. Like, that's got to be your last line because that's what they're going to remember. Or your first line, right? It's just like, I feel like the first and the last thing that you see or hear is always the thing you're going to remember the most. Just make the main objective that last line. Quick tip.
Yeah, and I've kind of picked up on the fact that there are people, including myself, who if you just give them a ton of branches, we will go down every single one in case there's some nugget of information we need. So I found that like in Mass Effect, the one that puts you forward is always the one on the right, and the ones on the left are more information, and you can kind of use that mechanism to know what's essential and what isn't. And I find that makes it easier for someone like me who's literally going to sit there spending hours listening to dialogue I don't care about just to find the one nugget I do. If you can indicate to me what's important, either just by having that be the through line or by having it be the only information I get and everything else is in logs and journals or whatever. Another trick is in branching dialogue, like the RPGs that I've worked on, we can use player responses to give more information or to get into the repetition that Tori was talking about. So if the NPC says, okay, you need to go over there and get the thing, and then the player's response says, all right, I'll go over there and I'll get the thing, then, that's kind of that repetition. And when they closed that conversation, the last thing they heard was two people telling them to go get the thing.
Well, the other layer too is, like I said, I'm gonna be like the one note talker on this. Trying to communicate it through means other than dialogue. So there are a lot of, the HUD that says, oh, kill 10 rats, whatever. That can be a little bit, people critique it because it's a little too hand-holdy and, making the games too easy, or so to speak. But there's definitely ways to make them more organic and feel more part of the narrative. So for example, Ghost of Tsushima, I am madly in love with the guiding winds because they put it in the narrative. It's like, oh, it's your father's, like, and it's so elegant because you can see it and then you're like, oh, where's the wind going? As opposed to like you've seen some games where it's literally a line in the ground, or and I do like the little map in the corner where I'm like, oh, okay, I see where I'm going, because I like maps to orient myself, but it is a little, I mean, if it's sci-fi, it's not weird, but in other types, it's a little, it's a little ludonarrative dissonance, as they say. So, but there's definitely ways to incorporate that. That's so that the dialogue doesn't have to do so much work. The dialogue can do what it's, ideally what it's supposed to do is communicate character and story, and not so much about like, okay, go kill 10 rats.
and that gets into narrative design and interacting with other disciplines too, because if you can say, go there, turn left by the big tree, then go underground and fight the thing, or you can work with the level designers and art to get there to be lights that point a certain direction, or there's the one door that's open is on the critical path, or like God of War and Resident Evil do now, which is they put like obvious yellow paint on the ladder you're supposed to climb or whatever. But I just played through Village, and I've been watching other people play through it on YouTube, and I see people who've played through it the first time, they don't really get lost because they follow these sort of intuitive clues that level designers and artists have put in. And that's another way that, like Anne said, we shouldn't just tell the story with dialogue. And another way to tell the story is to kind of guide the player in other ways.
Yeah, I remember Assassin's Creed Odyssey had a option where you could put in the objective markers and like keep them on, or you should take them off. And people will tell you like, go to this mountain and there's like a little cliff and you have to go to that cliff. I used objective markers because I wanted to clear the map and I wanted to do it quickly. But I love that that was an option for other people. Outer Wilds is really great with this as well. I feel like I'm not the first narrative designer to say this, but my husband played through it and he loved the fact that there was no objective markers. It was just completely like, oh, that looks like a cool planet. Let me go there. And then you find some notes, or maybe you talk to some people and you find out about that planet. Like the objective of the entire game is not really told to you. It's something that you have to find. And that's just kind of like a great example of like a very immersive gameplay where the player's curiosity is what's leading them forward, with some help with like there's like this notepad in your spaceship with all the like connecting points, and there's like question marks of things you haven't explored yet. So if you do feel like you're lost, you don't know where to go, you can go to that, which is a great optional thing. But like a lot of players, I feel like just wanted to explore space and all these cool planets, and they did, and then they learned what the game was just through that exploration.
Awesome. Jay, you mentioned working with like other departments, so design, artists, in order to tell the narrative, not having dialogue do all the work. What do your interactions with the other departments look like? What type of feedback do you give and receive with them? And like, are you just throwing like spreadsheets and like documents at them? How does it work? Not just at Jay, but at all your folks. Like, how do you work with other departments?
I think a lot more now than it used to be when I first started 100 years ago, but we're structurally designed in the way we're put together as a project to work together with other disciplines now. Like we'll have a team that's working on a certain area, and it'll be a writer or two, an area designer, an artist or two in kind of like a strike force that works on that area. And we would get together every other day for stand-up meetings to make sure we're communicating. And then in pre-COVID, we would have meetings with whiteboards and things, but now we have, Zoom meetings and things. But it's really just about being open, and it kind of gets down to wearing a lot of hats, sort of learning about other people's job as much as you can helps you understand what they are dealing with. So when you have to ask them to compromise, you understand what they're giving up, and it becomes this kind of like sort of game to try to persuade them or kind of understand like, no, if I change this character's gender, that may add 3 weeks to somebody's work because they have to build a female character model that they weren't planning or whatever. Like, or if I change this character's voice, that means that they might have to go and re-record something if it's really late in the project. Like just understanding where everybody's coming from helps with those interactions. So working closely together with them, you get a little bit more of that. You get to, the animator will say something and you're like, oh, okay, I guess that is a big deal for them. That isn't really a big deal for me. And at the end of the day, kind of unfortunately, the main through line for all of this is that up until a certain point when we're about to record voice, writing is the cheapest thing on the project to change. And it falls to us to kind of go like, oh, all right, I guess, that guy can't be a talking dog, so I guess he's just gonna have to be a guy. And that's really what it comes down to: understanding the people, and then just being willing to open up that chat window and make a video call and work things out rather than sort of sending emails around or whatever. At the end of the day, everybody's a person, so just understand each other is really the key.
Except for me, I actually am a robot.
Well, then we have to understand how robots work.
Yeah, I've actually really, working remotely. I often work remotely, and I've also worked on site. I also have, in the past 6 months, I've been working remotely with a company that is normally on site. And so it's very much just chatting over text. And that is apparently my love language because I'm so into having those conversations that way. And then just copy it like, oh, this. And then we're like exchanging screenshots and being like, oh, is this what you need? No, this is what I need. And I've definitely found that definitely within my groove. So, but again, it is great working on site and going over and just having to sit down and being like, let's talk about this. That's pretty good. And just seeing what people are doing by accident because you're walking by is pretty good too.
Yeah, the amount you work with other teams really depends on the studio. Again, I think smaller studios, you work with a lot more people, a lot more disciplines. In Spellbreak, I'm working with like the art teams much more heavily than I did with ESO because in ESO, like we had so many people and we were such a busy schedule. With Spellbreak, I'm much more like the person who is telling the art team like what I need and how I need it and things like that. And you work with some really amazing people, and you know you're asking like, oh, could you do this thing? Maybe it'll be quick, and they're like, yeah, that'll take 2 weeks, and you're like, okay, never mind. And you,
Will it though?
yeah, well, you basically you kind of also learn the cadence of like I think as a narrative designer, you have to be really cognizant of the cadence of other people's workflows. Like if I ask for an animation, depending on the animation, how long will that take, and like how much big of an ask that is. I kind of go into like I create like all these sheets of like, this is exactly what I need to tell my story, and I go into those meetings like, let's discuss like how we can save the most time, if you guys think that this can be done within the time frame that we currently have, things like that. You have to have an open mind. Like I said, I think Jay said like we're the squishy team where we have to kind of mold ourselves, and then VO comes in and we get to say no. I recorded that. We can't get more VO, like, or I can't change that VO now. It's gonna be the way I wrote it, which is nice, I guess.
Yeah, and you do the trick where it's like, okay, VO lockdown is a week before it actually is.
Yeah,
Everyone get everything in that day.
Yeah, for sure.
But on
Secrets.
I've been on teams where I was the only, like at Visceral, I was literally the only writer at the studio on there, and they were doing 3 projects. So I was kind of early on very busy, and at the end very busy. But in the middle of a project, I wasn't super busy, and I would kind of go into more of like a supervisory or like curation role, where I was just making sure that whatever was coming out of the production of the game would still serve that story. But on larger teams, I've always got something to do, and but understanding what everybody else has to deal with makes it easier for me to kind of step back and go, okay, the story needs this, but animation needs this, audio needs this, area design needs this, and kind of work out how to best to handle that situation.
So what I'm getting from this is when you're working with other departments, the key thing is communication, just like getting feedback. Like, hey, this is what I got. It's looking good. Okay, this is what you need. Okay.
Yeah, it turns out human communication is key.
Who would have thought? All right, so that's what working with other departments. What's it like working with other writers? Like Jay, you mentioned you worked as like the only writer, but you've presumably also worked with like a bunch of other writers. How do you stay organized? How do you maintain style? What are your interactions look like? Are you sharing documents? How does it go?
It's different on every team, and it kind of depends on leadership. I mean, it's different on every team is kind of the answer to every question. But on a larger team where you have a bunch of people writing different stuff, part of it is how you maintain style is partially how you divide the work. So if you have companion characters, each writer takes a companion character and kind of curates their style throughout the game. So if someone else writes something from that character, they'll go through and do a voice pass on it. Otherwise, you have the work and you have a lead or someone who goes through and just kind of makes sure that everything fits together. But if you divide the work up, like one person works on this hub area, one person works on this level and this level and this level, and those discrete situations, if the style are different between level 1 and level 2, it's not as big a deal as if you tried to have everyone dogpile on something and styles are different all over the place in one area. So that's part of it. And then it's just about having documentation, usually in Confluence or something, and chatting and having meetings where writers get together and hash things out. And again, human communication. But if it's just one person, then the style is going to be the same all the way through. And if somebody on the team doesn't like the style, then they'll ask you to change all of it.
Yeah, for ESO, worked with a lot of other writers, and it's a lot of like reviewing each other's work if you can and things like that as a lead. It's always really helpful if there has been like writing done on the game already, so there is a style already in place that people can read and kind of like familiarize themselves. I'll say that I know I'm not the first writer to say this, but writing fan fiction actually did help me a lot with like learning a style that of an IP, learning how the characters talked and like interacted with each other, and then creating something believable within that world really did help me then do that for ESO. Because like you kind of you familiarize yourself with the characters, you go back and you play the stuff that's come before you, and then you have the lead kind of come to you and like be able to review your stuff. But like yeah, being able to fit your writing into a certain game genre or a certain game IP is a really important skill that I think a lot of game writers have to do to kind of be in this industry, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then I want to talk a little bit about like students and stuff, right? So what are some of the most important skills for prospective game writers and narrative designers as they're starting out? Like we got like dialogue is a big one, right? But like, are there any that surprise you, or like things that you don't see like beginner writers honing well enough?
Ability to take notes. That's definitely the biggest issue, is because you can write your magnum opus and it could be objectively great, but if that's not what they're looking for, you got to be willing to change it. Mm-hmm. And so I worked on one game where, like, for whatever reason, it was like, oh, that's a good idea, we're not going to use it. And he's like, oh, I'll just use it on my own stuff. And that's like definitely the great way to do it. It's like nothing's ever cut. You can just use it somewhere else, and that's kind of good. I always love this expression: nothing is wasted on a writer. You can still use it. You just can't use it on this game.
Like that.
In the kind of games that I've been working on, a lot of branching narrative and stuff, logic makes sense, even a little bit of scripting ability. Even if you're not doing the scripting, but understanding how, if the player did this, then this happens, and how those things interact and how to keep them straight in your head and how to make sure everything works together. I mean, someone told me early when I was trying to get into game writing that game writing is almost less about writing and more about programming, in the way that you have to understand how everything fits together and have to be able to debug those situations to understand where you went wrong if something didn't fit together. Another skill is something that I just thought of and I've lost, so come back to me.
I'm going to kind of cop out here and say that Narrative Writer's Toolbox is a very good text if you have not read it. I actually read it as somebody who had experience, but was just like, oh, I should have some some textbooks about narrative design. I thought it was very comprehensive. It's like an intro of like, this is what narrative designers do. Has entire sections on like how to get into the industry and like what skills to have and stuff like that. And so whenever somebody comes to me, they're like, oh, can you like tell me like what a narrative designer is? I'm like, okay, first of all, that's not just one conversation. Second of all, here's a book. If you're really interested, I would just suggest you read this and then come back to me with any questions you might have. Again, a little bit of a cop out, but it's just more so that I can say in this, a 2-minute, even like a 1 hour rant. I really liked how that book kind of laid everything out.
Well, I don't think anyone will complain about a prospective resource to look at later. For any audience members, we'll try to get a link to that or like a title somewhere. Not me, because I am reading my own stuff right here. But still going on about like things that students can do to prepare. So Jay, you mentioned like preparing by like implementation programming. How important is implementation, for example, or having those skills anyway?
As far as getting a job, implementation, it depends on where you're going, but knowing something like Twine and being able to give them samples that they can play as opposed to just read, depending on the company, that may impress them more. But if you know how to use Twine, then you understand the basics of branching narrative and stuff like that. I don't think you need to understand C++ or know how to program that way to get in, but in most of the positions I've held, I've had to do at least a little bit of logical scripting. Like, was the player a jerk to this character? Let's remember that. If not, and then later on, if the player was a jerk to this character, she'll say this instead of this. That on that level, and then things like start combat at the end of a conversation or something, triggering events in the game. I've had to know how to do that stuff. And the more you know, the more you can understand what the area designers and scripters are dealing with, but B, the more you can take on in a situation where they're overburdened, or the more hats you can wear in a small team. In general, the more things you know about game development, the more valuable you're going to be as any person in game development. So I can't really recommend not paying attention to anything, but the things I would recommend that you know more about academically is just kind of basic computer logic, basic storytelling classes, and then just play every game you can, and just pay attention to how they tell their stories. The thing I forgot was it's not even something you can study, but it's the ability to know the difference between something you very much like and something that is objectively good, or something that will serve the audience. And some of the biggest train wrecks I ran into early in my career were times when I fully believed that my opinion was true with a capital T, and I found out that 30% of the players might think like me, but the other 70 wanted a different way, and we have to go that way. And so I was having to implement something I didn't think was great, but turned out to be good, turned out to be better than what I wanted to do for that project. So understanding, like figuring out what's wrapped up in my ego and what is not, and what is objectively good because of research or feedback or whatever. That's a huge one that you can't really teach. You have to get like soul crushed a couple times in order to pick up on that one.
All right. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that one? Okay, well, we'll just move on for now because I actually lost track of what the question was originally too. So we mentioned Twine. I love Twine. A lot of our writers are like familiar with some tools. To name a few, we might be as students familiar with like Twine, Ink, Yarn Spinner, Fungus, or RenPy. How important is it to like be familiar with the tool? How do your tools look like? So, for example, with Obsidian, I know Carrie Patel has given multiple talks on like your branching dialogue system, and it's been wonderful.
Fantastic. Those
Yeah.
tools. Oh.
So what types of tools do you use to write? How do they compare to what students might know? And like how do you interface with your work? Are you like just throw your documents at someone else and be like, hey, put this in the game, please? Or are you like diving in with some tools that some programmers have made for you? How does it work?
I'm just gonna say it depends on the place. So I have other things to say, but if anyone wants to jump in before I
Well, what were some of the best tools that you've had then, or some of the worst tools, if that helps at all?
Obsidian, 100% Obsidian. That thing will make coffee for you. It's beautiful. But other places I've worked where you just are in the tools the programmers made with no consideration for how to make game narrative in an easy and user-friendly way. That's happened too. I've written games in spreadsheets where the scripting was done by put a certain number in a certain column, and that will make the character do a thing on the screen because it's on a DS and we don't have storage space for an actual scripting language. I've also just written a script in Final Draft and they recorded it in audio, made sure the audio events fired when they needed to. But Obsidians by far are the best, and that's they have like a Unreal, I think, has it too, where you have blocks that are dialogue nodes and they're connected like a flowchart, and you write things in there, and then audio goes and records them. We have a kind of like a test auto voice thing where we get some really bad computer VO that happens, so you can kind of hear what it feels like paced out as somebody talks, which is pretty important. We have area designers that kind of stub in dialogues, and then we fill them in with awesome characters and stuff like that. At other places, I've been more like at BioWare, we were more responsible for creating the dialogues and making sure they flow and scripting them in and all that stuff. And then the level designers would implement them, just connecting the event to the file. So it depends on the place. I've worked with all sorts of tools. I've never worked with the same tool twice. So to the question of does the certain tool that you understand matter? I think it matters that you understand a tool and can have demonstrated that you can learn one, because every place I've worked at has had their own tools, their own proprietary tools that have been very different, and I've had to react to different levels of user friendliness and different levels of ability to affect the game within the tools. And just knowing a tool is kind of where you get your foot in the door. It says, I took the time to learn a tool. Here's my work with that tool. So challenge me with your proprietary tools, and we'll move on from there.
Tori and Ann, what have your experiences been like with tools?
Exactly the same. Exactly the same.
Yeah, Jay kind of laid it all out. I actually worked with a tool a lot similar to Obsidian's at Sauce, and I'm writing in Excel sheets now. I don't have much. We don't have much dialogue in Spellbreak, so it's not too bad. I'm not. If I was writing what I was writing at Sauce in spreadsheets, I'd be like, "Ooh." But no, it's not. The level of dialogue that we have is perfectly fine within spreadsheets as we currently have. At Sauce, we had the little grid thing, and I love that too, and we needed that for that mount. So like it's also about what your product needs and what your studio needs as well. So yeah, Jay kind of laid it all out though, honestly, the spectrum.
Got it. All right, so just a quick heads up, we are about like 10 minutes from like when we're supposed to wrap up here. I'm gonna try to ask a few more questions, and then we're gonna try to hit those audience questions. So audience members, give me a little bit of time. I'm gonna try to get through these questions quick. So, Ann, I wanna talk to you a little bit about this one. So you've worked like in video games, but you've also worked in like comics and TV shows and all sorts of wonderful stuff. And I'd like to know like what type of skills like from game writing make an interesting time in those other mediums, and what like skills from other mediums might be really cool for video games. How does it like mix and match?
Well, I think they all bleed together. I've definitely worked on a game that had comic book sequences in it, and obviously any animation, live action is good for the cinematic cutscenes you may be using in your game. And people sometimes rag on cinematics in games, but I'm sure we've all sat through one. We were like, wow, that was really good. Like, that was really cool. I'm glad I watched that. So that's kind of the goal, right? To have those moments. And I think definitely having worked in like animation and honestly having worked in CG in games is helpful going back to animation, because then you get an idea of like what kind of performances can be delivered and what kind can't. I've also been doing more in, I did an audio drama, short audio drama. And I think that's really interesting. Listening to audio dramas is really good because you can see how the performance can be delivered entirely by voice. And I definitely listened to an audio drama recently where I was like, wow, why didn't we get this good performances in our last game? Like, where's the disconnect? So I think all of that is really good because you can use it all. You can use it all.
Awesome. Now I got to go look at some audio dramas. It sounds great. I like that. All right, here's another one. How do writers and narrative designers who are like students who are applying for jobs now best showcase their work and abilities? Like, are we supposed to just throw, here's my like entire screenplay, or like, here's a video of some gameplay with some, like, here's the cutscene. How do we do this? You got any advice for us students?
Yeah, I'll say if you're going to have a writing sample, it should be 3 to 5 pages. Dialogue is great, especially for like game writing. They might specify, always look at what they're specifying. Some of them might specify, do not write for our game, because they're for legal reasons, basically. Like, you might be applying to BioWare Mass Effect game, and they're like, do not write a Mass Effect scene. You shouldn't. Don't do that. Oh, they'll just throw it away. Yeah, so 3 to 5 pages dialogue. I've kind of asked this question before, and the thing that I found most designers is basically like the TV script format, or the movie script format. It is very easy to read and very elegant. So, look up a template for that or find some sort of way to do that. To block your dialogue like that as well. And then you can also write little action scenes, like the player then goes, kills 10 rats and comes back, right? Like that's also something that you want to describe within your dialogue what the player action is, and you can do that in the kind of play format, like really elegantly, I think. So that's definitely a great writing tip example. Portfolios are also really important, so you can like link to your games or show videos of your stuff. I don't think I have the best portfolio out there because I'm not a professional portfolio maker, but I do have like tons of videos like of quests that I've written for, and I have some writing samples of some books that I wrote that I really like, as in-game books. I have not produced a novel. I have some songs I wrote for because I think that's fun. I have some trailers I wrote for, some marketing material that I wrote for, and stuff like that. So just like a nice sampling of everything that I've done. I know there's a lot of students who have like level design experience and writing experience and content design experience. So you want to kind of format those all differently, because if you have a resume and I'm looking for you as a writer for our project, I don't want to look at your level design work. I want to look at your writing work. So make sure that's very clearly labeled and showing like the best of the best stuff that you've ever done. I know Jay said this as well, but like anything that we can play is really impressive and really cool, even if we don't play it. But also like a 1-minute trailer or a 3-minute trailer of what you're doing that showcases some cool stuff, because I might have a lot of resumes to get through, or I have a really busy day. So just something really quick I can click on and you can showcase like all of your stuff is really impressive and really cool as well.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty much. I think Tori nailed it. You want to put your best foot forward, show the best you can, and pay attention. The strong thing I think is pay attention to every application that you're doing. Make sure that you're customizing it to the company. If you're applying for Obsidian and it looks like you applied for a World of Warcraft job with the way you wrote your qualifications and stuff, it's going to be fairly obvious because these people have seen tons and tons and tons of applications. So you want to make sure that portfolio wise, like I've sent an email with a list of YouTube links before and just gave them this is some of the best stuff I've done with some random YouTuber playing it. and this, so just so you can get an idea, and pick the ones with the best voice acting if you have that option. But you want to make sure that you pick the best stuff, and that shows them that you are capable of doing like a fair range of different things. But if you're really good with character dialogue, make that TV script, do that audio drama or whatever. If you're really good with sort of game design, narrative game design, maybe try to do like a 3 to 5 page design doc for a story. But really pay attention to what they're asking for. That was the main thing that Tori said that I was really picking up on, was make sure that you're giving them what they asked for, because if you don't give them what they asked for, if we had an application who said like, oh, you have this whole test and stuff, but I'm just going to give you some of my awesome samples. And we were just like, donk. Like, and not to be cold or anything, but it's like, if you can't follow instructions on a job application, you're telling them that you probably can't follow instructions on the job. And that is a big problem for especially a writer on a team that's going to have to deal with feedback and game design documents and do things that they don't necessarily think are good from their opinion, but are good from other people's opinion.
All right, well, we are running up to the end of our time here. I actually didn't manage to get through I didn't get to audience questions. And I don't think that we have time to take them, but I've tried to answer some of them through some of the questions that we've been asking during this session. If there are any other questions, well, we'll try to get to you if we can. Really quick, these were our lovely panelists, Anne, Jay, and Tori. Is there any way we can find you folks, your work, follow what you do, like, I don't know, social media, or just what to look out for in the future?
Yeah, I'm Tori_Schaefer at Twitter. My DMs are open. So if you guys have any questions about specifically stuff that I don't know, I've done, or any questions you want answered, I'll go through my DMs and I'll be happy to answer them. I also have toryschaefer.com. Really happy I grabbed that one. So you could also contact me through my website. But yeah, my Twitter DMs are probably the ones I'm going to check most, to be honest. So Tory_Schaefer.
Yeah, I'm a little bit too old for Twitter, so if you want to know anything about narrative design, go to Tory_Schaefer.
Yeah, and I'm on Twitter. It says there, but in case that's not visible, it's A-M as in Mary, E-L-Y. That's my Twitter handle.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, folks, for joining us. And I think that that'll be it for our writing panel. So for any audience members, stick around. We're gonna have some like showcases and stuff coming up next. So hope you have a great summit experience, and I'll see you folks around.